We have the banking API guru at Mulesoft. Mulesoft, a very good friend of the Open Bank project. And we have with us Danny Healy, who's going to talk about the Super 8 of APIs. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ishmael. I think I'm good. Hi. So I'm going to give you the what we call the Super 8 of API strategy. Earlier agendas, you might have seen it as the 10 commandments, but I found out I had 25 minutes, so we sort of cut it down a little bit. What I hope to share with you is insights, observations that I've gleaned working for Mulesoft over the last 18 months in our customer bank organisations in the UK and Ireland around adopting API strategy within banks, but from an API industry perspective, I guess. So Super 8, it's a camera format, right? I guess most of you are familiar with that. Home movies during the 60s, 70s were shot on it. So I thought just to guide us through as well, I'd sort of sprinkle in a little bit of a film theme and see what lessons we can sort of link from a couple of movies, a few movies, to some of the lessons that banks are learning now. So, first of all, in initial meetings with organisations we're working with, typically what people want to know is what's going on out there right now at the moment. It's a little bit like almost like an anxious teenager. You know, are they missing out on something? Are they too late? Will it ever happen? What are others doing, right? There's a curiosity there. And actually the curiosity grows typically as the seniority of the person you're talking to grows. So that the further they get away from their teens, the more this anxiety seems to exhibit itself. Now, whether it's a retail bank, investment bank, corporate bank, whether within that it's a COO, CTO, an architect, they all want to know what's going on. And the response to that is there's a lot going on in several different ways, and probably you could put it into three categories. There are banks that are looking at APIs as a business technology to enable participation in the API economy, new go-to-markets, which Paul was talking about earlier on. There are initiatives around just doing IT delivery better, being able to deliver more customer-centered solutions quicker using APIs internally. And also there are tactical API things going on. So in local projects, there are isolated solutions starting to appear to solve particular pain points. Now, for those three buckets, in terms of how much is going on, well, on the tactical side, in the last 12 months, certainly my experience is there's been a big interest in API management solutions. There's been a rush of RFXs, responses required from organisations like mine around providing technology, and quite often the thing that started that is PSD2 or CMA remedies. You know, people are starting to think we need some technology now to support these initiatives. And actually, I would say the majority of those tends to have a very narrow focus, actually, in terms of how APIs are going to be used. There's some immediate requirements that they sort of match API management technology to, and isn't necessarily, as you'll see from some of the other points that I'll run through in the Super 8, isn't necessarily going to get you to a position where you have a strategic platform in place to support open banking over time. It's more really creating potentially a technology silo to solve some of the regulatory pieces that are there at the moment. Now, from better delivery, I'd say half the organisations that I go into are looking at using APIs to improve integration. They already do. To really think hard about who's going to consume any integration point that's created to try and drive greater adoption of that. And then from the perspective of using APIs as a business technology, I wouldn't say a lot of organisations have really got into gear there yet, and I think it keys back to Paul's point where he had a whole list of APIs you would expect to be measuring if you were really doing it properly. I think most people are probably looking at that thinking, oh yeah, you would want to be doing that, but whether they're really doing that, I don't think so, and I think that's reflected, even in my own experience in the last couple of months since August. We've been involved with assisting with cases that someone on the board, actually in both cases it was a COO, have been involved in starting to put a case together to present to the board for a broad API strategy as a business technology within the bank. And in that sense, I think there's a whole set of things, catalysts, if you like, the regulation, where the technology is, that's starting to actually get this heard at the board level now. Okay, so what actually, why have an API strategy in the first place? Well, banks are slow movers. That's been mentioned earlier on today as well. I think if you look at other industries in the last decade, there's already evidence of technology, right, as obvious examples, disrupting other industries. And it's technologies like mobile, cloud, social, SaaS. All those things mean that there are new competitors coming into markets, displacing incumbents, because their cost of entry is going down and technology's enabling them to reach out to audiences in new ways. And if you look in those traditional markets, it's not necessarily the biggest organisations that are winning. It's typically the fastest. And an example that gets put out there a lot is some of the traditional retailers. Someone like Sears, for instance, always at the top of the Fortune 100. You look at the last 8 years, though, they've started to struggle. And of course, somebody else has come into their space. And it's Amazon. They have a different operating model. They're a platform company. And because of a few other things I'll mention in a moment, they're rising up to the top right in the last 8 years. So opposite fortunes. Now, how that translates to what banks are trying to do is really they're trying to adopt the same model in terms of becoming more of a platform in the way Amazon is. They want to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship and new relationships at the edge of their organisation. And they want to do that through exposing their functionality of the basis of these new ecosystems that will develop in the API economy. Now, thinking about that, what do you need to do to be a successful platform company? Again, you can look at Amazon, and what they've done is, first of all, to achieve scale, they've enabled reuse and self-service. So you think about where their revenues come from, 40% of them come from organisations external to them who are using services that they've exposed on their platform. And through doing that, they can foster innovation at the edge of Amazon. Now, something else they do is they have a real drive actually on quality as well. And the way they do that is through having standards within the platform that they create for those reusable assets. And also really engendering a lot of consumer feedback as to whether the services are good as well, or the goods that are offered generally on that platform as well. And finally, what they do is they always retain ownership of those assets that are being used by other organisations. So they have total visibility to everything that's going on in that set of services that are offered. And that provides them with a lot of data, obviously, that they can exploit. But as I say, they'll keep the data, but they push the actual innovation, the offer to the client, out to the edge of their organisation. Now, something else that applies in banking strategy, what's going to engender this move to platform? Quite often it's also a need to be more client-centric in banking rather than being so product-focused. And a great example of someone from another industry who's already been through it, because there aren't that many examples of traditional banks that have done it right, is Ryanair. And they're someone who had a strategy where really they were ruthlessly efficient to the point where they would push a passenger as far as they'd go, make the journey as unpleasant as possible until they wouldn't fly with them anymore, just that point before, actually. But there's noticeably been a change. I don't know if anyone's flown with Ryanair recently and booked flights with them, is they made a conscious decision to move away from being just a seller of cheap tickets to being a travel partner for their passengers. That's how they see it. And they provide a travel platform now so that when you book, you're offered from third parties things like taxis, meals, trips, hotels, all relevant to where you're going, insurance, all those third-party benefits. And it's the client that's really been put at the centre of their platform. And we see banks doing that as well, trying to move away from a product mentality. And finally, platforms allow people to move quickly. So again, going back to Amazon, they really pride themselves on their speed. They want to move quicker than their competitors, and they put speed, agility, and inventiveness at the centre of doing that. So once you have a strategy, someone, of course, is going to need to deliver on it. And from a technology perspective, getting a technology capability in place to support APIs in a bank, of course, the IT organisation is going to be involved in that. So how is IT doing in terms of delivering what the business requires generally in banks? Well, probably most of the conversations I have, it chimes pretty early that quite often IT is not as responsive as a particular business system owner would like. And if you look at why that's happening and why it seems to be getting more visible as well, is of course IT's got a constant delivery capability from a centralized perspective or back-end system perspective. But what we see is a whole set of new pressures, customer expectations around digital, regulatory requirements like PSD2, CMA, possibilities of the API economy, and actually the new competition that will engender as well. All these things are driving, well, they're putting technology at the centre of the business, right, in banking. It's got a real focus, and it will drive more requirements into the IT delivery organisations. And what you get is a widening gap in terms of the ability to deliver. So a new operating model that certainly in a number of banks within the UK now, high street retail banks, we're working with to put in place, not just technology, but the operating model as well, is a shift in the focus of how things get built within a bank. And that is that the centralised capability focuses more on creating reusable assets and then providing enablement for other areas of the bank to serve themselves those assets to meet their requirements. And in that way, you can federate innovation over a far larger area within the bank rather than central IT, centralised organisations in line of business too, feeling that they need to build out all the requirement. So what you get is a model that, as opposed to traditional IT delivery, focuses equally on consumption as well. So there's a focus on building reusable assets, not just by centralised IT, but also business projects themselves, contributing assets over time. And then putting the right enablement in place for developers to be able to discover those assets and to self-serve access to them. So it's a low friction model for them to adopt the APIs that are being built. And of course, important too in the operating model is understanding how the APIs are being adopted too in terms of feeding back from the consumption model aspects that might improve the production model over time. Now, Everest, never let go. It's a pretty scary gap there, and there's a similar gap quite often when people are building banking APIs. We've seen it in several projects that we've been involved in. Quite often when people are sort of taking the more tactical view, they might think, okay, we need APIs. At the edge, they're quite tidy things, right? People can specify at the edge things in a nice, tidy way because they don't have to reflect the reality of traditional banking technology estates, which are pretty messy. They're built up over a long time. Let me just give you some examples. There are typically application islands built around given products. Across those different islands, there's no common concepts, typically like customer. Package solutions are used. Custom solutions are built out in a whole range of technologies. Newer approaches like microservices are certainly being looked at and used as well in certain areas of banks. Data gets replicated around to facilitate business solutions. That can get desynchronized, become stale. But it's all to meet the needs of the bank's clients and also providing digital tools for their employees, ultimately. So you can see there's a gap because whenever solutions are required, capabilities will be required from different areas, right? They need to connect solutions to underlying IT assets. And unfortunately, the way that's been done, typically in banks, again, and I don't think I go into many banks who disagree, is most business projects just think about their own connectivity needs. There's no worrying about what might have been done before, how it might benefit them, or how they might benefit something in the future either. And typically what you get is solutions connecting directly to the systems that they need the data from. And over time, what you get is effectively a web being created, a complex web, which introduces dependencies that aren't necessarily visible. And what happens is the complexity increases, people become less ready to make change in those systems because they're not sure what's touching what. And you get a sort of a paralysis and that lack of agility that's common within banks from a business perspective. And every project's as hard as the last one as well because it's always having to reinvent its connectivity solution. Now, in order to, and sorry, the idea there was just, the road to hell's paved with good intentions, right? All those projects are built for the right reason, but they're just set up to deliver in a certain way, which is suboptimal from a cross-bank perspective. Now, in order to combat that, within banking organisations that we're working with, the platform we provide and the approach that we adopt with those banks is to try and get some paradigms in place to align and organise those applications differently in the way they network with each other. And those paradigms are try and introduce reuse of services. So once some systems have been connected together for some functionality, that's available for later projects to use. Also, for back-end systems accessed, then that should be able to be reused by later projects. They shouldn't have to reinvent the connectivity needs for a particular back-end. And in doing that, what you do is just build the right connections rather than everything connected to everything else. And an important part of that is defining the right abstractions, how you layer APIs. So, for instance, a front-end developer is insulated from the underlying details of a mainframe-based back-end banking system. And what happens if you can sort of achieve this sort of connectivity in an organisation is complexity goes down over time, and organisations can move quicker as they're able to plug into the network, either contribute new value to it through building blocks they might build, or, of course, reuse building blocks that already exist for their solutions. And the point, I point out one thing from here, and that the way we encourage this is through a balanced approach where, yes, you do have an idea of a platform, but you never sacrifice the idea of ultimately you want to deliver business solutions quickly. So there's just enough enablement in the operating model that we work with banks to produce, just enough enablement to allow this to emerge bottoms up. So projects start to build out areas of this network of applications, if you like, through serving their own needs, that building out the functional requirements that will build the solutions they want. Now, in terms of getting the abstraction right, and this is a popular field with my daughters, they're teenagers, the idea, and you might not all have seen it, the idea here is there's factions of different people who do certain things. Now, APIs, if you look at them themselves structurally, typically you could say they're all the same. They have an interface that can expose out to many consumers. A good API would be productized in certain ways, policy applied to it, etc. And it's connecting to some underlying data source or functionality that it's exposing functionality from. But actually, APIs are different. And we have an approach, API-led connectivity, whereby we categorize certain types of API based on the role, and then we can really focus having the right technology to build those. And also, again, support the operating model that allows independence of groups from each other, centralized IT and business unit IT groups. And the layers, if you like, the main categorizations are at the bottom, system APIs, which are typically about exposing functionality in systems that already exist, either transactional processes or data. And it can modernize those interfaces and protect those interfaces as well in terms of making sure traffic's controlled to those layers, and also that they're accessed in a secure way. So that's the role of those system APIs. Process APIs typically do some sort of orchestration across those systems. So if you think of something like virtual account management, for instance, that might aggregate several products kept in different back-end systems related to a customer. So for instance, their balance and their spend in their credit card, their balance and their spend in their current account, and so on. So that layer would take care of that orchestration. And then for a particular solution, so you can see here a web app API, we provide experience APIs, or we recommend that customers create experience APIs, which really focus on the ultimate consumer in terms of the way they would want the data for their solution. Because they're not going to understand necessarily the different data formats or the aggregation and the integration that you need to do at these lower levels. And of course, the idea is, as new business requirements were driven out, so for instance, if a personal finance manager was required, this is something similar to, we worked with a retail bank in the UK in their digital platform to support. If a new requirement like personal finance manager is required, it's not necessary to go out and build this connectivity, this functionality. Only additional functionality is required that can combine those capabilities that have already been built elsewhere. And this layering has operating benefits as well in terms of how you can start organizing more independently. There's contracts between all the layers, and typically the different layers are created by different groups within a bank. So back-end system owners or central IT typically create system APIs, whereas experience APIs obviously are focused on a particular business initiative. They'll have different teams of developers. Sometimes they might, you might have a slice through it where you have a team that's focused on all. But over time, as you put an application network in perspective, these groups should become more independent, move at their own speeds, so that, for instance, someone developing a digital experience or an API for a partner ecosystem at that level isn't constrained by the speeds that the systems at this level typically move at, which tend to be lengthy release cycles and long periods before you can release new functionality. You don't want to get lockstepped with those, which of course is what happens a lot within banks when they're looking at mobile apps launching those or new APIs. Typically, they go to their internet platform. That's what they've had to do in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not really fit for purpose for that sort of speed anymore. And hence, banks are starting to build digital platforms in the retail banks. Now, we've learnt a lot already if we just stand back about how technology is adopted. I think, in all areas of technology, you always see this. People are always reinventing the wheel or making the same mistakes. And what I'm referring to here are 2 mistakes that have commonly been made over the last 20 years with enterprise software, and that is business logic's always put in the wrong place, and people are always tempted to do point-to-point connectivity, and that has issues that I've already shared with you earlier on. It happened with early client server. People put too much logic in a fat client or maybe in a stored procedure. With J2E and .NET, people would put too much logic in the web applications. With integration efforts, people would put sometimes too much logic in the ESBs. And now with API gateways, again, we're starting to see people tempted to put logic in those as well. And what happens is you get hairballs of code, and it becomes unclear where functionality is and what systems are being connected to. We keep making those mistakes, and why is that? And why do we even see it in the latest carnation? Why don't we learn our lessons? I guess part of that is there is a rush to technologies like API management at the moment, and if you look at what API management's about, it's about securing, exposing visibility around endpoints. Of course, that's just one part of the overall API lifecycle. It's not just about management. It's about, for instance, implementation as well. And in order to implement an API, ultimately, you need to connect to an underlying resource to have some sort of functionality. And the way API management solutions typically plug that hole in functionality, if you like, is through allowing scripting on the gateway. It's easy for a developer to do. It's appealing. They can make a decision quickly and do that if they want. But as they do that, they're going to start, or they do start, building technical debt into those solutions that at some stage is going to have to be unwound. Now, Fantastic Four, Captain Fantastic or something like that, he can stretch incredibly. Now, of course, open APIs are going to drive a lot more traffic into banks' infrastructure as new partners start tapping on the functionality they provide or new channels are built on top of those APIs. And I'd say, over the last 2 years, there's not a bank that I've been in the UK, certainly not a retail bank, that isn't considering, over the next few years, having a plan to move towards public cloud infrastructure. And probably the majority of those organisations as well who are thinking that way are already doing things like implementing platform as a service in their digital platforms, so technologies like Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes and Docker, that they can deploy microservices into where the business functionality is, and then use that as a sort of a lift and shift layer from on-premise to cloud when they make that decision, the time's right, to go to public cloud infrastructure. Now, what we're seeing with banks who are adopting PaaS is they're looking at a more scalable and robust way for doing this so that they can stretch. And the reason this is pertinent to APIs is typically API management, if you like, API gateways. What they're about is mediating between a consumer and underlying services that are going to provide the functionality for a consumer. And in a PaaS-type environment, typically the way that will work is a gateway will sit to the side of those services. Now, as you get more load, of course, what you're getting is sort of network hops between one environment and another, and That sort of scares people who are responsible for keeping bank infrastructure up and running when you get more layers and more hops. And of course, that can be compounded if you've got a chain of API calls as well within internal APIs. So there's an alternative model that, again, in the UK, we have banks who are starting to adopt this model using our technology, which is actually to, within the microservices themselves, embed the policy enforcement component. So rather than having a separate gateway, actually minimize the hops through having a policy enforcement runtime, if you like, embedded within the container to a level where you could have one microservice in a container, one of hundreds or thousands, with its own dedicated policy enforcement point. And that gives you extra robustness in terms of you're not having to make the network hops anymore, you're within the container, or actually, for Java microservices, Spring Boot based or Mule based, you've got the gateway embedded within it. And finally, the final point is there's a lot of fish out there, right? Finding one's difficult. And there's going to be a lot of banking APIs as well. You think about something like corporate banking, payments commoditized. One payment platform will look quite like another. How do traditional products deal with that? Well, they're commoditized. They're all fizzy water and sugar, more or less. But you've probably got your favorite because it tastes a certain way and the brand engages you in a certain way. And it's similar for APIs. They're going to be products for you. They'll be the basis of competition in the API economy. One way you'll attract people is through your commercial model for use of those APIs, but the other one will be centered on how you engage your API's audiences. And because APIs are technical products, those audiences will be development organizations. Now, there's two things developers hate. One, being told what to do. Two, having to ask for permission. So you've got to have an operating model that really works with that. You look at open source, for instance. You're not necessarily going out with a stick and telling people to use your APIs. It might not be the most successful model. Similarly, you've got to get the right model in place to engage communities of development organizations for your APIs as well, which means your API should be easy to find, they're cataloged and visible in the right way, they're easy to understand, so they're designed in the right way. Think about experience APIs that really think about the consumer, so what they do matches the task a consumer might want, but also to understand there's the ability to play with these things, sort of in mock sandboxes, before you commit to them. And the other important thing is that people can independently reuse these. They can pick it off, whether internal developers or external developers, and it's a very straightforward process to actually use the APIs. Now, in order to put those Super 8 in place, we're working with customers with, well, I don't know if you know Mulesoft, but we have an API platform. It does the API management piece. That's a really important piece. But it also does the design part in terms of building out the right APIs, the engagement part around engaging, having tools to engage developers, marketplaces, if you like, provides a runtime, which gives you a lot of flexibility in how you deploy, so you can scale and be robust and look to the cloud in the future. It's hybrid in nature. And we also provide IP around an operating model. We're not a big services company, but we have ideas that we bring into organizations, and we'll work with either banks or the partners. And part of that is also bringing in accelerators. So we do have an accelerator for open banking and PSD2. I won't go through the run of Super 8 now. Hopefully you can look at that in your own time later on. But I will point out that we do this workshop. You find out a bit more about Mulesoft Anypoint platform. See the accelerator as well. We'll show you that today for PSD2, CMA initiatives. And as a standout side, if you want to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Thanks. Do we have questions? We have time for a couple of questions, maybe one or two. Questions, anyone? Okay, I do have one for you, Danny. In one of the slides, you were talking about the sort of layering of APIs, right? And actually, I do have 2 questions for you. The first one is, do you think there's going to be like a performance issue if you put APIs on top of APIs? And the second question is, because of this slide, do you think in the future, banks in particular will sort of manage and administrate a ecosystem of APIs, so different, like you were talking about system APIs, process, experience, maybe other APIs in the future. So how do you see that?
So is this a real-time trading system architecture? No, because there obviously are hops, there's latency involved. It doesn't have to be great latency. Typically, it's about 10 milliseconds between layers in average API gateway use cases. It's a trade-off, ultimately, between what you're enabling the organization to do in terms of delivering technology capability differently. So you look at these good things, performance, a different operating model, and you balance them against each other. And certainly for banking cases in investment banks, asset management groups, digital platforms, there's not a performance issue with doing this. And the benefits outweigh it in terms of how you can organize differently and build products quicker.
Cool. Do you have any other question? All right, well, Danny, thanks a lot. Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks, Ishmael.
Very insightful.